Something that's very exciting about this panel is that here we are in Silicon Valley, and most of the time in Silicon Valley we're really talking about disruptive technology like blockchain, but its application to new nascent industries that might be hundreds of millions and maybe a few billion. So what we're talking about here, though, are trillion-dollar industries, multi-trillion-dollar industries. Supply chain is a $50 trillion industry. If you look at logistics, depending upon who you talk to, it's like $5 to $10 trillion. I'll be speaking about healthcare. Healthcare is about a $10 trillion industry globally. FinTech, finance, matters who you speak to, but $10 to $20 trillion industries. So what I'll do now is I'm just going to ask each of the panelists to tell us a little bit more about what they're doing with blockchain so that you can get a sense, but we'll keep it short, maybe 20 seconds. And so Dale, because we just heard you speak, maybe you could tell us a little bit about the POC that you've done?
Yeah, the very first POC that we did was in the dispute resolution space. It involved two big box retailers that you would recognize, and we were talking past each other. They were ordering, the two of them, the shipper and the receiver, were ordering via purchase order. We were handling something on a bill of lading basis, and we didn't know what was actually ordered, and we were picking up and delivering what we were given, but it was still a dispute and several million from our point of view, and more than that on the other side of things. So essentially that's where I got to the reference to the common language. It allowed us to get to this least common denominator to say, oh, here's how many at the SKU or serial level I could actually determine what it was, because I couldn't at a box or a pallet or a larger level.
Wonderful. And that single source of truth, one of the fundamental capabilities of blockchain. Ganesh, if you could tell us a bit. Gangesh, I'm so sorry. Gangesh.
So thanks, Jorden. My name is Gangesh Ganesan. I'm founder of a Silicon Valley-based blockchain company called PeerNova. And as Jorden mentioned, we specifically work in the financial industry space, and the problems that we most solve are problems associated with what we would call post-trade processing. Just in a high level for people here in the audience who want to understand these kinds of problems. When two banks, let's say JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs, get into a trade, part of the regulatory framework that allows them to do the de-risk the trade involves getting a middleman in the middle, right? And this middleman is somebody called a clearinghouse. And instead of JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs doing the trade directly, the trade is mediated through a central clearing counterparty. Think of it as like an insurance or an escrow agent in the middle of this transaction between these two parties. Now, the minute you introduce a middleman in the picture, the flow of information that needs to happen is much more complex. Much like what Dale was talking about, parties would think that their trade is X, but the clearing party might not know and might not have recorded the trade in exactly the same way. And in the global trade, as you can imagine, very complex trades, very complex instruments. We're talking about things like interest rate swaps, credit derivatives, credit default swaps, which are very complex financial instruments. In literally tens of trillions of dollars of notional value gets exchanged amongst parties every day. So our solution enables how do you remove the friction in this? How do you remove exceptions in this? How do you make sure that the data is clean and transparent across these parties when they do the trade?
Thank you, Gangesh. So again, this source of truth, and then I would think there's going to be a lot of automation in there as well. Mark, can you tell us a little bit about Blume Global?
Yeah, sure. So actually, Blume Global is not a startup. It's been around for about 25 years. And we've had all of the major railroads use our software, as well as most of the ocean carriers use our software. So we have very good information in terms of asset management, as well as all the moves within the terminal and ocean carriers, right? So this is actually a good point back to cold chain, right? So cold chain, so the two use cases we have for blockchain, which we've implemented, one is provenance, right? And there's two different parts of that. One, provenance is not necessarily good for visibility, right? Because it's just like, what's just another cloud application of it? But it's really about the source of truth, right? So, and in fact, before this, I worked at Infosys, where I was in charge of the blockchain initiatives, as well as AI and ML for business applications. So I think the use cases really are around provenance and source to truth, right? That's one. Second one is contract management, right? So my former life, I was a chief architect at Manhattan Associates and Logistics.com and chief supply chain architect for HP. And one of the big things was procurement, right? So understanding the truth of the contract itself, right? And this is actually a big thing currently within supply chain because of drivers, right? We have a big driver shortage in the United States, as an example, right? And one of them is getting them paid immediately. So what's the source of the truth for moving something from Shenzhen to Cincinnati, having the demurrage charge for the container, having the dray move, the ocean, and what is the truth and who agrees to it, right? So I think that is the major use case we're working on right now. But those are the two, and I look forward definitely for the provenance one, but I think the smart contract management is going to be something that's going to be very important, right? And we have a network of ocean carriers as well as all the rail carriers in the United States, as well as some large BCOs like Walmart and Target, as an example, that are involved with that move those goods and also the engagement and understanding the transaction that occurs. Right. So those are the two.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mark. And Suzanne, can you tell us a little bit about Food Trust?
Happy to. Hi, what a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me on the panel. So we at IBM have had several blockchain initiatives for a few years. The one that I lead is a blockchain specifically targeting the food industry. So you may have heard Walmart and other retail companies, as well as suppliers who are co-opeters. I got to work on the right language there,
Just
Dale.
stick with the co-opetition
Co-opetition
and
is
work
the
it
best.
around from there, I think.
So we built a blockchain that allows companies to share data in a blockchain system, but also permission that data so it's only visible to those who are in linked parties and linked transactions. And why that's so important is because they wouldn't do it otherwise. This is part of the governance for the solution, which I'm sure we'll get into during this discussion. And we now have over 90 companies. We have many of the top retailers here in the US, one in Europe. Now you can walk into stores, scan QR codes on food products with your mobile device and find the source of that food product. As a consumer, you can do this today in certain stores and more coming. So we are working in consumer, we are working in food safety. I think Dale mentioned the use case around leafy greens and romaine, where we have every food product recalled whenever there is a contamination. And you, as consumers, can't buy that food product. And there's no reason for that. If we know the source of the contamination, we should be able to find it in our supply chain, and that's what the solution does. You can target recall products off the shelves, off the trucks, off of your DCs, off of your stores, for those that are identified in contamination. So food safety, consumer traceability, food fraud, where about 1/5 of food products are mislabeled. When you go into a store, you cannot always trust the label. So giving consumers a way to know that what they're getting is indeed what they are purchasing. And also supply chain efficiency. There's a tremendous amount of paper-based management in the food supply chain and in other supply chains. And having that digitized so that we have a data record that is transparent and immutable is really forcing a whole industry to come together around how to share data in a way that there is that common denominator that was mentioned earlier. We know that this bottle of water is represented the same way across the whole chain. And that's what we've been working on for the last few years, and now it's in market. It's been in market since October. We have a lot of interesting projects running on it, and hopefully I'll get to share more of that with you during the session.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. So obviously we all eat food, and knowing where that food comes from and if it's safe to eat, and if it isn't, basically locking down the supply chain and ensuring that, those that do have good food and they're not penalized by a system that can't differentiate between those that are giving you good food and those that are giving you food that may have some contamination. So thank you very much, Suzanne and the rest of the panel. This next question, Dale talked about the future, and because we're here in Silicon Valley, I'd really like to dive into the point about blockchain as an underlying trust layer and then building on top of it with AI and IoT. We have 3 members of the panel who are in the area of supply chain and logistics, and I'll let them speak a little bit more about the IoT and the AI solution. But I'd really like to get Gangesh's take on this, because in the finance space, how do you see, Gangesh, that AI and potentially IoT, but maybe the AI mostly, can be used with blockchain?
Yeah, so thanks, Jorden. I think one of the things that we've learned in the financial industry, while the financial industry has been traditionally one of the largest spenders in technology, they buy a lot of hardware, a lot of software. There's lots and lots of processes today in the financial industry that are semi-manual and highly inefficient. I'll give you some simple statistics. Bank of America, which is one of the largest retail banks and also institutional bank as part of Merrill Lynch, has over 100,000 software engineers working for it. Now, if you sort of look around and say some of the largest software companies in the world are in Silicon Valley, and Google probably does not have 100,000 software engineers. So what exactly is Bank of America doing with 100,000 software engineers? That's the actual number. Bank of America has 100,000 software engineers. Forget the number of other people working in Bank of America, 100,000 people in software alone. The reason for it is that vast numbers of their middle and back office processes today are highly inefficient, fragmented. They have hundreds, thousands of databases today. In part of it is regulatorily driven. If I'm a global financial institution, I cannot have a single book or record. What that means is that in each jurisdiction that I'm actually operating, I have to have financial statements for that particular jurisdiction, which essentially means I have to maintain my financial statements in different formats for each of these different jurisdictions. Now, just imagine if I'm Bank of America or Citi and I'm operating in 100 different countries, I literally have to obey the local laws of that country. Now, I have my financial statements essentially distributed in hundreds of databases around the world. So the key is, at the end of the night, there's lots of rules around how trading is done between banks, how money is moving between banks. And on a nightly basis, banks have to settle their accounts with each other before they open to the market the next day. This process is very, very complex. So banks end up exchanging vast amounts of data with each other. And the idea is to build a common ledger platform amongst each other, which would allow them to share this data in a more efficient way. So just like Dale was talking about it, it's a data language by which all the standard financial instruments are represented in a common way across these databases and across these different institutions, across different jurisdictions, and solving it. But blockchain alone is not the solution to the problem. You need blockchain. You need certain types of cloud technologies that would allow you to connect all of this at scale. And certainly, vast numbers of these workflows need to be automated using things like AI and machine learning. Blockchain is one important component for guaranteeing the veracity of the data, but the process automation and improvement comes from other technologies as well. Smart contracts are a part of it, but tying smart contracts together with machine learning and AI is what would allow this type of an efficient financial industry to operate. So the idea is overall going in and saying eventually, it's not about saying simply, why do I need 100,000 software engineers in Bank of America? It's about saying, how do I turn the effort of these engineers into something far more efficient and productive?
Thanks so much, Gangesh. And Suzanne, you mentioned you've got 90 customers, I'm sure a whole bunch of deployments. How do you see IoT specifically and then potentially AI coming with your blockchain solutions?
Yeah, happy to share some current use cases on that too. So again, all of us eat food. There's a tremendous amount of impact that temperature has on the quality of your food and also on your perception of that food, even if it's damaged or if it's slightly off color, and that produces a significant impact on what you're going to buy as a consumer, either in a store or even at a restaurant. So a company who we've been working with, this is public information, GSF, Golden State Foods. They supply beef patties to one of the largest quick serve restaurants that you were all familiar with. They moved from frozen beef patties to fresh beef patties. And the shelf life on that went from 70 days to 14 days. So when you have fresh foods, it's tremendously important to not just keep track of the temperature, but also to know how long it's been since the point of either production or, in the case of produce, harvesting, and how that's going to impact your taste as a consumer, but also operations in their stores. So now imagine cases of food product that once could sit in a cold storage facility for up to 70 days before use, now has to be used within just a few short days. So having that precision on this is the case, this is the box that I need to use now as the store manager, knowing exactly which one to pull off the shelf is very important to them. So they instrumented the whole supply chain with IoT devices and temperature sensors that's tracking the journey of that food product from processor to the stores. Exceptions, right? There's millions of transactions. We don't necessarily need in this use case every temperature reading, but the smart contract describes what's the acceptable range for this particular product, and that could be custom for any two companies who are doing business together, whether it's beef patties or whether it's something else. And those exceptions that are happening are recorded in the blockchain system. So they have full transparency to each other on when those exceptions are occurring, and also know how many of those exceptions are allowable before that product's no longer saleable. So it's driving inventory, it's driving their ability to understand how the food product has been impacted along the supply chain. And they've talked about this publicly too. You can see more information about it online. There's a video that shows their operations instrumented with IoT. So what does that also help us with? It's analytics. So now I can start to look at data coming from maybe my suppliers, if I was the restaurant or the stores, and understand where are there dwell time issues in my supply chain? Where has food product been sitting around a little too long for me to want to sell it to my consumers? Where should I be focusing my supply chain efficiency efforts if I have 14,000 stores? Which are the ones that are at the highest risk for improper food management? So that gives me a focus on where I want to put my attention on supply chain issues, and that's all driven through the data that's being collected in the blockchain system.
Thanks so much, Suzanne. And Mark, I guess you have a number of different solutions that you've already provided. Are you also using IoT and AI?
Yeah, so as an example, you guys hear me? So as an example, 42% of the chassis in the United States are on our platform right now. So that means anything that happens out of Savannah or happens out of Los Angeles or happens out of Oakland when you take the BART, we actually know where that is, right? So that's where all the IoT is, right? So we know when something is unloaded. The issue is that there's a black hole in supply chain. We know it's, 19, 17, 22 days, whatever, from Shenzhen to Long Beach, as an example. But then what does it say in the port? And it's exactly back to the question about, one example is cold chain, right? So cold chain is what happened to that shrimp from Vietnam that actually, what was the temperature? Is it spoiled or not? So those are all the IoT examples that happen. Blockchain is very interesting, especially as relates to contracts and making certain you understand who is privy to the contract, what actually happened, and they're aware of it immediately, and we can pay, right? So, because we have finance solutions that actually do the procurement, right? But the other part of this too is what is the AI ML platform in which is doing demand forecasting, doing supply demand matching, and also understanding where to position things, what's going to happen historically, what's the promotion that's going to happen for Walmart for Easter or for Halloween, whatever it may be, and predicting where to put things. And this is one of the big things I think that's very interesting in terms of where the future is, right? IoT is information flowing into the systems itself, and blockchain is immediate understanding of the contracts and execution. But AI and ML is actually very important as relates to the prediction, population, and future of how you execute your supply chain. And that's how we see it, right?
Wonderful. Thanks, Mark. And I'll just make a quick note about supply chain for healthcare. And Dale already talked about this with the Drug Supply Chain Security Act at a high level. But there is a ruling that was driven by the FDA and passed by Congress in 2013 that by 2023, in November, in the United States, and there's similar types of laws for Europe as well, all drugs need to be traceable. So what that means is the consumer should be able to scan a QR code on a drug and make sure that it's actually authentic. As we've probably heard with the opioid epidemic, there are a lot of fake drugs that are coming in through the internet into the US market, most of them from overseas. And this type of problem is actually very large outside the US, where around 10% in general, and up to 30 to some cases 50% of drugs may be fake in some countries. So this is a very big issue, and being able to track and trace the drugs, the medicines, so that people don't get sick or worse, die. About 100,000 people a year die from fake drugs. And so this is a very important point for drug supply chains. Now I'd like to come back to Dale's point about co-opetition, which he was eloquently talking about before. Clearly working with competition, so both competing and working together, is something that people have talked about, but never at scale, right? And never with large players. So in terms of co-opetition happening, can you give us a little bit more detail about what would be required in a solution so that competitors could work together, and what kinds of things could they share, and then what would be available to the end customer? What kinds of things would they be interested in?
Yeah, I think that this is not our parents or our grandparents. I'm mic'd up. I'm from the presentation. Thank you. This is not our parents or grandparents' competitive environment. That's not what we're talking about here, where you sat at an arm's length and you didn't spend any time with them, and you said, I'm standing away. Don't get too close, kind of a thing. And so I would tell you that almost no companies that I know of go through an employee orientation and say, here's how to speak with somebody that works at UPS or DHL or whatever example you want to throw out there. I mean, the antitrust attorneys are still concerned about that. Wait a second, and all those kinds of things. And rightly so, right? That's the world in which we live. However, I think the piece that we're not yet fully understanding in some cases is when I refer to, it's not about where we compete, it's about where we can agree. Well, if you think of, a stack, whether it's a technology stack, whatever the case may be, and you think of these foundational pieces on the bottom of that, and at the top would be an app, something that would be FedEx proprietary or IBM proprietary, or whatever the case, whatever the example may be. And IBM may be playing in multiple spaces. I may be referring only to this space at the very top of that. That's where we can agree. That's where we can talk about building these, where do we agree down here? That would be no different than talking about safety. Why couldn't UPS or DHL or others talk about safety? That's not controversial. This is non-competitive technology that we're referring to. That's the layer that we're talking about, is the non-competitive technology. Certainly we will all compete. Certainly we are all in business to do certain things, and there's many, many business models that will lay in over the top of these things, as we've just discussed. We certainly think blockchain will be a connective tissue there. It will certainly be a complementary layer. But we also know that, whether that's a cold chain example, whether that's a food example, I would tell you the same thing. My version of that same example would be that you're going to get to near real-time supply chain with what we are now talking about, with the track and trace, with the blockchain, with the sensor-based logistics, and with the machine and deep learning and AI and those kinds of things. And so a medical device company in his space is going to say, look, I know that the polar vortex is about to hit Chicago, And meteorologists are telling us that, so we've got 18 hours to react to something like that. Well, near real-time supply chain means that I actually know what's going on there, and I can actually move that product in a very quick manner to the point where it's actually into the surgical suite before that person broke their ankle. Because they know that when they get so much snow or they get so much cold or whatever the case may be, those things are going to happen. So when you start thinking about big data, it's the same thing. What happened and why did it happen is our rearview mirror. But now we're going to start pondering these very interesting what will happen, that's predictive, and how can we make it happen, and that's now into the prescriptive side of things. So these become very interesting conversations to have and to kind of ponder.
Thank you so much, Dale. Now, we only have a couple minutes left, and so what I'd like to do is just have each of you just answer one question for me, which is, if you look out over the next few years, in your particular space, your particular industry, how long would you say it's going to take, 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, before more than 50% of the companies in your space are actually working with a blockchain-based solution? Obviously, they can be using AI, IoT, and other technologies. It's not blockchain exclusive. But let's say in your space, 50% of the companies, how many years? Suzanne, we'll start with you.
So I'm going to answer that two ways. One, we already have a significant portion of the retailers here, at least in the US, on our solution today. So I would say we're there. Are we at over 50% of their food products at scale and enough volume for us to be able to do the use cases that I mentioned around food safety and traceability? No. I think that will be another year to 2 years to get all of those food products into the system at scale continuously. But I think we're there. I mean, we're so close. Like, I'm in that city, but I'm building the city with a bunch of other companies, and it's going to take some time to build it up.
Yeah, so I don't want to put cold water on this, right? But I think it's 2 to 3 years at least, right? It's nascent technology, and what's going to happen? It's really about the private network, right? So Walmart is a good blockchain program right now, right? And they can force their suppliers, but they try to, I'm not that young, right? I remember RFID in 2003, right? So it's going to be some task to do that, right? So I think that's going to be it, right? So that's my observation. Not that we will solve it and we will get it done.
Okay, thanks. Gangesh?
In the financial industry, just about every major financial institution around the world has done a number of different POCs and pilots over the last 4 or 5 years. Okay? And just about all the financial institutions are actively, currently trying to look at trying to take the technology to production. Yet, I think, the bar in many of these industries is quite high. The level of maturity of the solution to solve an end-to-end use case or a complete workflow in particular financial instruments or even new financial instruments like tokenized assets is going to take a while. So we think that there are use cases that will come to production now and within the next year. But the broader adoption, in terms of end-to-end digitization happening in the financial industry, across the world, I think that's a bit of ways away. I don't even know how long that could take, significantly beyond, say, 2 to 3 years.
Okay, great. And Dale, your thoughts?
Well, there are, I don't know what the right number is. You quoted the dollar figure. It's in the big trillions, right? So there are tens of thousands and thousands and thousands of carriers in whatever you think of as the supply chain. That's not going to happen anytime soon. There are some that actually have the resources to do this from an IT point of view. There are many that couldn't afford to put electronic logs in their trucks, right, to do that. So that's the co-opetition. That's why I've been saying for a couple of years, blockchain is a team sport. That's the entire point here, is because while we may have the resources or others may have the resources, we also have to get with Customs and Border Protection, and we have to sit shoulder to shoulder with them, and we have to figure out how to solve this, and we just challenged them a couple of weeks. Yes, you can mandate that. If you'll mandate blockchain, even if it's 5 years out or whatever the case may be, all of us will align to that. You're in the FDA space. You get that from the FDA point of view. They planted a flag and said 2023. Right? So it's years out from that point of view. There are certainly early use cases that work right now. We're interested in the broader strategic and scalable use cases, and those are still out on the horizon. But getting together for people to recognize that they are actually teammates, whether they knew that or not, is one of the big points here.
Okay, wonderful. And I'll just say for healthcare, it's probably about 3 to 5 years. We're having some of the biggest players across pharma, payers, and providers just starting to take a look at the technology and building their initial consortia. So work in progress. There are solutions that are available today. There are use cases that are here today, but it will take co-opetition, and all of us need to come together in order to make this happen over the next 1 to 2 years or the next 3 to 5 years. So thank you all very much, and if you could give us some applause for the panel, that would be great.